There is a profound misconception when we think about the ancient world and its great monuments. We often imagine that any colossal structure, clad in precious metals and raised with the sweat of thousands of workers, was nothing more than the whim of a megalomaniacal king, a simple demonstration of military and economic power to intimidate neighboring empires. And although the human ego has always played its part in the history of architecture, reducing Solomon's temple to a mere display of wealth is to completely misunderstand the mind of the biblical man. This building, probably the richest structure the ancient world had ever seen, was not designed to be a palace. Its purpose was infinitely more ambitious, almost unthinkable. It was the literal, physical, and theological attempt to recreate the Garden of Eden on the summit of Mount Moriah. It was the exact point where heaven and earth were meant to collide, intertwine, and become one again. To understand the magnitude of what was raised in Jerusalem, we have to go back in time, leave behind our cities of steel and glass, and place ourselves around the year 900 BC. The geopolitical landscape of the Middle East was brutal, a chessboard where empires like Egypt and Assyria dictated the rules through blood. However, at this specific moment, there is a strange pause in history. A power vacuum among the superpowers allowed for the emergence of a united kingdom in Israel under the command of Solomon. Jerusalem was not just a religious capital, it had become the epicenter of global trade routes. Caravans loaded with spices from Arabia, wood from Lebanon, horses from Cilicia, and gold from Ophir crossed its gates daily. It was an era of such overflowing prosperity that ancient texts claim silver became as common in Jerusalem as the stones on the ground. A golden age that the Hebrew nation would never, in all its subsequent history, experience with such magnitude again. It is in this context of incomprehensible abundance that construction begins. But if you were to approach Mount Moriah during those 7 years of building, you would notice something deeply disconcerting, something that defied all the logic of ancient engineering. You would not hear the noise of hammers. There would be no din of chisels striking stone, nor the grinding of iron tools. The biblical account is very specific in this detail. The immense limestone blocks that formed the main structure of the temple were quarried, carved and polished to perfection in distant quarries underground. They were transported and assembled on site like a colossal puzzle, so that an almost unnatural silence reigned at the sacred site. Why go to such logistical trouble? Because this is where architecture becomes theology. Iron in the ancient world was the metal of swords. It was the material of war, of death, of bloodshed. And the temple was to be, by definition, the house of peace. In fact, the very name of Solomon, Shlomo in Hebrew, derives from the word shalom, peace. This sepulchral silence during construction was not a technical eccentricity. It was the building's first great theological portal. It was telling you, before you even crossed its doors, that the God who would dwell there was not a God of warlike chaos like the Canaanite deities, but a God of order and reverence. As we approach the finished structure, the first thing that overwhelms us is not the building itself, but the immense outer courtyard surrounding it. And here, the visual narrative changes drastically. If the construction was silent, the daily operation of the courtyard was quite the opposite. Imagine the scorching Middle Eastern sun reflecting off one of the engineering marvels of the Iron Age, the Sea of Bronze. It was not a simple fountain. It was a colossal water tank cast in a single piece of burnished bronze, resting on the backs of 12 life-sized metal oxen, 3 facing each cardinal point. It contained tens of thousands of liters of water. The weight, the logistics of casting something of that size in the Jordan Valley and transporting it uphill to Jerusalem is something that still baffles metallurgists today. Next to this artificial sea, flanking the main entrance of the portico, stood two solid bronze columns nearly 9 meters high. They did not support the roof. They were independent monuments. They were named Jachin and Boaz. He establishes, and in him is strength. They were sentinels of pure metal. But the presence of so much bronze in this outer courtyard was no coincidence. Bronze is associated with judgment, and this courtyard was the place of sacrifice. We have to be honest about what ancient religion was like. It was not the sterile, silent, and scented experience of a modern church. The courtyard of Solomon's temple was a sacred slaughterhouse, the deafening noise of sheep, goats, and bulls, the thick coppery smell of blood being sprinkled against the base of the enormous bronze altar, the unbearable heat of the fire that burned day and night, consuming flesh, fat, and bone, the flies, the black smoke rising into the blue Judean sky. It was a visceral, raw, and frankly disturbing scene, but that was exactly the point. All that death, all that noise and smell served as a brutal reminder of the weight of humanity, of sin, of the constant need for purification before daring to take a step toward the divine. The outer courtyard was the real world, with all its ugliness and violence, desperately seeking redemption. But then, the priests left the courtyard behind. They climbed the steps, passed between the bronze columns, and crossed the enormous folding doors of olive wood. And as they closed those doors behind them, they left behind the noise, the blinding sun, and the smell of blood. They entered the holy place. And here, reality itself seemed to alter. The contrast must have been paralyzing to the senses. Suddenly, the floor beneath their bare feet was no longer the cold stone or stained dust of the courtyard, but planks of the highest quality cypress wood. But that was just the beginning. The walls, rising nearly 15 meters high, were completely covered in cedar wood from Lebanon. Not a single centimeter of stone was visible in the entire interior. And that wood was not smooth. It was meticulously hand-carved by the best artisans of the ancient world, showing reliefs of gourds, open flowers, palm trees, and cherubim. And over all that carved wood, gold, pure gold, beaten into thin sheets, covering every wall, every flower, every palm tree, every cherub from floor to ceiling. The historian reading ancient texts often wonders if this is a literary exaggeration. But Assyrian and Babylonian records of the time confirm that the wealth accumulated in Jerusalem made this perfectly possible. It was not empty ostentation. It was, again, an overwhelming theological message. By surrounding himself with golden palm trees, flowers that never wither, and angelic figures, the priest was entering a restored Eden, an incorruptible paradise where nature, represented in the wood, had been elevated to divinity, represented in the gold. It was the visual promise that the state of natural perfection that humanity lost in the beginning could be recovered. In this space, bathed in a warm and supernatural glow, the daily resources of the temple took center stage. There were no windows to let in sunlight. The only lighting came from 10 immense solid gold lampstands, the menorahs, 5 on the right and 5 on the left. Imagine the scene. Dozens of pure olive oil lamps flickering, their flames reflecting infinitely on the carved gold walls, floor, and ceiling. The holy place must have looked as if it were literally burning with liquid light. Under that light, to one side, stood the table of the bread of the presence, also made of gold. Upon it, 12 loaves of fresh bread replaced every day of rest, the Shabbat. 12 loaves for the 12 tribes of Israel, perpetually presented before the face of God. It was the symbol of communion, of divine provision, of a shared table between the Creator and humanity, even if humanity could only be represented there by the priests. But perhaps the most fascinating and mysterious element of this room was the small golden altar at the far end, just before the next division. The altar of incense. Twice a day, morning and evening, a mixture of spices so exclusive was burned upon it that the law forbade any citizen from replicating it for personal use under penalty of death. Stacte, onycha, galbanum, and pure frankincense. The smell of the holy place was not that of the roasted meat from the courtyard, it was the penetrating, sweet and intoxicating fragrance of the cedar forest mixed with this sacred incense. However, the incense was not there just to smell good. It had a much deeper and, if we think about it, terrifying function. The thick smoke rising from that golden altar formed a constant cloud at the back of the room. Why? Because just behind that altar hung the veil. And behind the veil dwelt a presence so dense, so pure, and so overwhelmingly holy that the divinity had to be veiled, obscured by smoke, so as not to consume the mortals who approached. In the same way that parables used everyday stories to hide deep truths from those not ready to understand them, the smoke of the incense was the physical barrier of mercy that protected man from the lethal purity of God. That veil was not a simple curtain. Later, rabbinic texts recalling the temple tradition suggest it was as thick as the palm of a hand, woven with threads of twisted linen in blue, purple, and crimson colors, and embroidered directly into the fabric like menacing guardians were cherubim. This is no minor detail. In the book of Genesis, after Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, God places cherubim with flaming swords at the entrance to prevent them from returning. The temple veil was exactly that, the final frontier. The reminder that although the priest was inside a golden Eden, the absolute center of paradise remained closed, until the moment came to cross. The architectural, spiritual, and emotional climax of Solomon's temple was found behind that heavy curtain, the Holy of Holies, the Divir in Hebrew, meaning the place of the word, or the oracle. Upon pulling back the veil, the flickering golden light of the lampstands was left behind. The Holy of Holies was a perfect cube, 20 cubits long, 20 wide, and 20 high, and it was plunged into total and absolute darkness. There were no windows, there were no lamps, there was no natural or artificial light. The contrast is fascinating. While the pagan deities of the time were worshipped in sun-drenched sanctuaries, exposed for all to see their statues, the God of Israel dwelt in thick darkness, a darkness that did not represent evil, but unfathomable mystery. A God who cannot be contained, nor understood, nor illuminated by human ingenuity. In the center of that absolute darkness rested the most sacred object of antiquity, the Ark of the Covenant. A small chest of acacia wood covered in gold, containing the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments, broken and restored, a jar of manna from the desert, and Aaron's rod that had budded. The Ark was covered by the mercy seat, a solid gold lid with 2 small cherubim cast at the ends, facing each other with wings outstretched toward the center. But Solomon was not satisfied with the small cherubim of the ark. To fill the immense void of this dark cube, he ordered 2 gigantic cherubim to be carved from olive wood, nearly 5 meters high, and overlaid them with gold. They were so immense that they stood side by side. The outer wing of one touched the north wall, the outer wing of the other touched the south wall, and their inner wings touched in the exact center of the room, hovering directly over the Ark of the Covenant. Together, they formed the invisible throne of God. The Ark was not God. The Ark was simply his footstool. The tension surrounding this space is hard to exaggerate. Throughout the year, the Holy of Holies remained in sepulchral silence and darkness. No one entered, no one looked inside, until the annual cycle of the Hebrew calendar marked the 10th day of the 7th month, Yom Kippur, the day of expiation. Only on that day did the high priest, stripped of his luxurious golden garments and dressed only in pure white linen, as if it were a burial shroud, dare to cross the veil. He carried in one hand a censer with burning coals from the altar, and in the other, a bowl with the blood of the sacrifice. The fear must have been paralyzing. Tradition says that the reverence was so extreme, the terror of God's purity so real, that the priest entered trembling, knowing that any error in the ritual, any impure thought, could cost him his life right there in the darkness. Outside, in the immense courtyards, thousands of people held their breath. Silence fell over Jerusalem. The fate of the entire nation, the forgiveness of their collective sins for another year, depended on that solitary man, shrouded in incense smoke in a dark, gold-lined room, being accepted by the divine. When the high priest finally emerged, pulling back the veil and returning to the light, the collective sigh of relief from the nation was deafening. That moment, that instant of survival and grace, defined the ancient man's relationship with the inaccessibility of God. He was there, in their midst, but at the same time, he was infinitely set apart. Now it is normal that upon hearing such detailed descriptions of this splendor, modern skepticism arises. Did all this really exist? Was it as magnificent as the texts say? Or is it simply a nostalgic exaggeration of later writers? To anchor this account in reality, we have to pause and look at what the earth itself tells us. Archaeology. If you travel to Jerusalem today and visit the Temple Mount, the immense esplanade that dominates the city, you will not find a single stone that Solomon touched. Nothing. Zero. The imposing retaining walls we see today, including the famous Western Wall, belong to the Second Temple, massively expanded by Herod the Great nearly 1,000 years later. Of Solomon's original temple, razed to its foundations, no direct remains are left on the surface. Furthermore, modern political and religious sensibilities make excavating under the Temple Mount absolutely impossible. It is a zone sealed off to archaeology. However, the absence of direct evidence is not evidence of absence. Because when archaeologists began to excavate on the periphery, on the slopes descending from the mount toward the ancient city of David, the earth began to speak. And what it told validated in an amazing way the wealth and administrative complexity described in the biblical texts for that era. Down there, in the dust of millennia, monumental structures from the 9th and 8th centuries BC have been found. Hundreds of bullae have been discovered, small clay seals hardened by fire, bearing the names of royal officials, priests, and scribes mentioned exactly in the pages of the Bible, such as Gemariah, son of Shaphan. These seals tell us of an immense bureaucracy, of extensive royal archives, of a city that was not a simple village of shepherds, but the nerve center of a highly organized and prosperous state. Perhaps the most moving and poetic find is a tiny object, the size of a thumb, carved from hippopotamus ivory, a perfect pomegranate. The pomegranate was a recurring decorative motif in the temple, sculpted on the bronze columns and embroidered on the priest's garments. This small ivory artifact bears an inscription in ancient Paleo-Hebrew, which, although partially broken, reads, "Belonging to the temple of Yahweh, sacred to the priests." Although its authenticity has been the subject of intense debate, similar and continuous finds in the Ophel area and the Kidron Valley paint the undeniable picture of a Jerusalem that, in the Iron Age, overflowed with a level of craftsmanship and cultic devotion that matches the memory of Solomon's temple down to the millimeter. The proof of the temple is not in its fallen walls, but in the immense administrative and historical shadow it cast around it. But all this majesty, all the gold, cedar, bronze, and incense was destined for a tragic end. An end that would shake the very foundations of human faith. We move forward in time to the year 586 BC. Geopolitics had changed. The power vacuum that allowed for Solomon's glory had closed. The Babylonian Empire, under the relentless command of King Nebuchadnezzar, dominated the known world. And Jerusalem, after a series of disastrous political rebellions by the last kings of Judah, found itself surrounded by the most formidable army on the planet. The siege lasted months. The hunger within the city walls was apocalyptic. And finally, on the 9th day of the month of Av, in the middle of the sweltering Middle Eastern summer, the defenses gave way. Babylonian soldiers burst into the city with a thirst for blood and destruction, accumulated after months of military frustration. When they reached the summit of Mount Moriah, they found themselves before the richest structure in the world, and they showed no reverence. How do you destroy a building made of immense stone blocks? The Babylonians knew the technique. They entered the temple and began to smash the carved furniture. They broke the cypress and Lebanon cedar wood. They piled the dry wood inside the holy place and the Holy of Holies and set it on fire. The fire must have been an unimaginable hell. The cedar wood, rich in natural resins, burned with uncontrollable fury. The heat inside those sealed walls became so intense that the limestone blocks of the main structure, expanding violently, began to crack and burst. The wooden roof collapsed, sending columns of sparks and black smoke into the night sky, visible from miles around. And then there was the gold. Thousands of kilos of pure gold that lined the walls. With the extreme heat of the forest fire trapped in the building, the gold began to melt. The precious metals liquefied, running down the flaming walls, flowing like bright burning tears, seeping into every crack, into every fissure of the floor slabs. When the fire finally went out days later, the Babylonian soldiers literally dismantled the immense stones of the temple, prying and toppling the walls block by block, just to be able to scrape and recover the melted gold that had cooled between the joints. Thus was fulfilled the mournful prophecy that not one stone would be left upon another. Outside, in the ruined courtyard, the gigantic bronze columns, Jachin and Boaz, were smashed with sledgehammers. The monumental sea of bronze was broken into pieces. All that metal, sacred and revered for 400 years, was loaded onto carts as simple war booty and taken to Babylon. The Ark of the Covenant disappeared in the chaos, lost forever in the shadows of history, giving rise to millennia of legends and fruitless searches. But the true tragedy of the year 586 BC was not architectural, it was theological. Imagine being an Israelite, chained, being led into exile, looking back and seeing the house of your God reduced to smoking ashes. The mental crisis must have been absolute. In the ancient world, if your temple was destroyed, it meant one of two things. Either your God was weaker than the God of your enemies, or your God had abandoned you. How could the creator of the universe allow his own house, the place where his name dwelt, to be plundered by impure pagans? How could he allow fire to consume the restored Eden? The answer to that question, forged in the pain of exile by the rivers of Babylon, changed the trajectory of human religion forever. The prophets and priests, mourning the loss, began to understand something revolutionary. God was not defeated by the Babylonians. God, in his sovereignty, had allowed the destruction. He had withdrawn his protective presence long before the first torch fell, because the people had corrupted the purpose of the temple. They had turned the house of peace into a den of thieves. They had believed that as long as they kept the building standing and the sacrifices burning, they were safe, no matter how much injustice, corruption, and idolatry they practiced in the streets of Jerusalem. The temple had ceased to be a reflection of heaven on earth and had become a magic amulet of false security. And God preferred to see his own house burned to the ground rather than allow his holiness to be used as an excuse for human sin. This devastating realization gave birth to a new way of understanding faith. In exile, Without a temple, without altars, and without sacrifices, the people had to adapt or disappear. And so, synagogues were born, meeting places where stone or gold no longer mattered, but rather memory, the study of sacred texts and communal prayer. They learned by force that the divine presence was not geographically confined to Mount Moriah, that the God who dwelt in the thick darkness of the Holy of Holies could also hear them in the dust of Babylon. And this is the powerful synthesis that the history of Solomon's temple leaves us. It was the richest building in the world, a masterpiece of human craftsmanship and religious devotion. Its walls of shining gold and its cherubim with immense wings captured the imagination of humanity for millennia. But its ultimate purpose was never to contain the Creator. It was impossible. As Solomon himself recognized on the day of its inauguration, lifting his hands to heaven, "If the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house that I have built?" The temple of stone, wood, and gold was always a pedagogy, a temporary visual lesson. It was designed to teach a primitive humanity about holiness, separation, the cost of sin, and the beauty of redemption. But once that lesson was assimilated, the physical building became expendable. The story of Solomon's temple closes by moving the concept of God's dwelling from a dark and terrifying cube in Jerusalem towards something much more intimate and profound. It set the perfect stage for the modern understanding of faith, where the torn veil and the final sacrifice would mean that the spirit of the divine would no longer dwell in temples made by human hands. The most glorious building of the ancient world was destroyed, yes, but the idea it represented survived. It evolved. It transformed into the belief that the new Holy of Holies, the new point where heaven and earth collide, is not a stone building clad in gold. It is the human heart. And as the ashes of the first temple cooled in Jerusalem, leaving a nation orphaned of its sanctuary, a persistent question remained floating in the air of exile. When they finally returned, when they were allowed to go back to that sacred mountain decades later to try to rebuild what had been lost, what kind of house would they raise from the rubble, knowing that the ark had disappeared forever? But that is another story.